Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
This episode contains graphic descriptions of lovemaking that may be unsuitable for young ears. Listen with care. It's the 1930s, and antiquarian Arthur Burrell is on the edge of his seat. He's been working on the cipher created by his friend John Lister's ancestor, a woman named Anne. In the 1880s, John had found his great-aunt Anne's diary, nearly 8,000 pages, hidden behind a panel in his ancestral home, Shibden Hall, in Halifax, Yorkshire. Back then, he'd tried to decode the ciphered passages, but had little luck. When John Lister died in 1933 with no heirs, the home and the diaries it contained reverted to the Halifax Corporation. Burrell, a friend of the family, agreed to take another stab at deciphering the code, which contained Greek letters and algebraic symbols. And now he was on the precipice of a historical event, the significance of which he barely understood. With the self-satisfaction of a successful scholar, Burrell cracked the code and began translating the encoded portion of this woman's diary. But very quickly, he began decoding passages that worried him immensely.
This woman recorded with unladylike frankness her bodily functions. Quote, up at 7, to the pot. Long, very thick piece with some difficulty. She even confessed to self-abuse, noting with an X or cross in the margins of her diary when she was compelled to masturbate. Quote, incurred a cross thinking of Miss Walker. Burrell is deeply disturbed by this frankness, but nothing prepares him for the most shocking discovery. First, Anne Lister, secretly dressed as a man in the privacy of her own rooms, recording her cross-dressing affairs in code. Second, Anne wrote extensively of intimate feelings for other women, referring to some women as her wife and herself as their husband. Thirdly, and most shocking of all, Anne Lister had sex with other women, recording the number of orgasms she and her partners experienced during their lovemaking.
Burrell slams close the volume he's working on and mops his brow. He's convinced. These events, these sentiments, these words must never see the light of day. Burrell immediately contacts John Lister, recommending he destroy the diary to wipe this shocking account from the historical record. He's certain the Lister family would never recover from this scandal if their ancestors' activities became known. Thankfully, the Lister family didn't take his advice. Still, it took another half-century before the decoded passages of Anne Lister's diary were available to the public. Today, we're telling the story of Anne Lister's life in her own words, with a special emphasis on her search for a great love. But along the way, we'll also try to give you some examples of why her diaries have been deemed the most important documents in LGBTQ+ history. I'm Marissa.
And I'm Elizabeth.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We are so thankful to all of our Patreon supporters, especially our auger and excavator level patrons. Carl, Alyssa, Maria, Colin, Denise, Edward, Jesse, Judy, Karen, Lauren, Lisa, Megan, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you enjoy what we do here but aren't yet a patron of the show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
Anne Lister was born in 1791 in Halifax, England, to a wealthy, landowning family. From a young age, Anne was an intelligent, confident, extroverted, and physically active girl. She was intellectually curious in the extreme, devouring the classics, mathematics texts, and teaching herself several languages. She ate sparingly and exercised vigorously. Unusually for the time, Anne was designated as heir to her family seat, serving for some of her life as the Lister family matriarch. As such, she recorded her dealings with the families of Halifax and Yorkshire's larger social milieu. She traveled extensively and pursued risky endeavors like climbing treacherous mountains, ignoring war-related travel bans, and braving the Russian winter. And perhaps most important to our purposes here, she's considered history's first modern lesbian.
Before her words were available for the public to read and discuss, Anne Lister's diaries were studied by a motivated contingent of women scholars. When Muriel Green in the 1930s, Vivian Ingham, and Phyllis Ramsden in the 1960s began studying and transcribing the diaries, they were allowed to only under the condition that they did not publish any of the inappropriate material. For decades, only a few people in Halifax knew about the coded contents of the journal. When Phyllis Ramsden encountered, quote, objectionable material, she omitted it from the transcriptions with a note that it was, quote unquote, nothing of interest. And note, we'll be focusing particularly on the nothing of interest. But this source is so rich that dozens of scholars could dedicate their careers to Anne's diary and still have material left over. Politics, hygiene, health, estate management, social customs, fashion, travel, all of these things are covered in detail, and they are worthy of study even without the juicy bits. After the women's liberation movement in the 1970s and 80s, the sensitive parts of Anne's journal were revealed to the public. Helena Whitebread and Jill Liddington transcribed, compiled, and edited massive portions of the text and published the previously unmentionable parts. And we are deeply indebted to all of these women scholars.
Anne grew up in a household that encouraged her intellectual pursuits. Her uncle, James Lister, who owned Shibden Hall, recognized her sharp mind and treated her more like a son than a niece. She received an excellent education for a woman of her time, studying at the Manor School in York and later at the school in Ripon. Even as a teenager, she displayed the confidence and masculine presentation that would define her adult life, wearing black clothes, keeping her hair short, and walking with the commanding stride that earned her the local nickname Gentleman Jack. My first introduction to Anne Lister was through fiction. My favorite author of all time, Emma Donoghue, wrote a novel about Anne Lister's first love affair as a girl in a Yorkshire boarding school. Donoghue's novel, Learned by Heart, tells the story of Eliza Rain, a half-caste girl in an uptight ladies' boarding school in the 1800s. Though Donoghue's character is partly fictionalized, the real Eliza Rain's story requires little dramatization.
Eliza Rain was the illegitimate daughter of an East India Company surgeon and his Indian lover, and illegitimate because interracial marriages were not officially recognized. Eliza and her older sister spent their childhood in Madras. Their lives took a turn for the worst when their father became ill and returned to London for treatment. He died during the journey, leaving his girls in the care of an EIC colleague, William Duffin. Duffin arranged for the girls to be brought to London, where they attended boarding school from 1802 to 1804. In 1804, they were brought to Duffin's family seat in Yorkshire and enrolled in the Manor School. Eliza boarded at the school, but due to her biracial or quote-unquote half-caste and illegitimate status, she was housed in the school's attic, separately from the other students.
It was in this attic room, dubbed affectionately by the girls as the Slope for its sloped ceilings, that Anne Lister joined Eliza as a roommate. Anne was disruptive and strange. She was not particularly deferential to authority, and the courses at the Manor School were either too easy for her, like with reading and writing, or of no interest to her at all, like needlepoint. Anne and Eliza made an odd pair. By all accounts, their relationship turned romantic in short order, and they used the privacy of the Slope for frequent sexual encounters. By the end of 1804, the two had pledged themselves to each other, referring to themselves as husband, that would be Anne, and wife, which was Eliza. The two planned to abscond and live together in southern Europe once Eliza's trust became available to her when she reached adulthood.
For Eliza, these vows were lifelong. She wrote love letters to Anne for the rest of her life. But Anne's feelings for Eliza changed between 1806 and 1808, when the girls were made to spend some time apart. Anne may have been expelled from the Manor School. Eliza began to suspect that Anne's affections were waning. In one of her letters to Eliza, Anne wrote, quote, "I assure you, Eliza, that I am very steady in my attachments, and though not deemed of an affectionate disposition, I feel that I can be strongly attached to my dear and best friend, E.R."
By 1810, Eliza was extremely unhappy and living with an elderly cousin, which was a condition of her inheritance. Her letters to Anne reek of desperation. In them, Eliza refers to Anne's new love interest, Isabel Norcliffe. Anne showered attention on Isabel, but she was also distracted by the death of one of her brothers. In an attempt to resolve the issue of Eliza's now unrequited love, Anne suggested that Eliza marry a Halifax man named John Alexander. Increasingly enraged by Anne's rejection and frustrated with her lack of control over her living situation, Eliza began to self-destruct. She had fallings out with her distant English family and her guardians, the Duffins. In 1813, Anne's last surviving brother, Sam, died in a drowning accident, leaving Anne as the ultimate heir to the Lister estates. Preoccupied with family affairs and a host of new love interests, more on this to come, Anne neglected Eliza further.
In a cruel twist of fate, Eliza was committed to an insane asylum owned by the father of the woman who would become Anne's third lover, Mariana Belcombe, in 1814. She was imprisoned there until the asylum closed in 1853. There is at least some evidence that Eliza's obsession with Anne may have contributed to Eliza's commitment to the asylum. After her commitment, Eliza asked Anne to obliterate evidence of their romance. Quote, "The particular question I had to ask is, if you have our school letters, though they be still in your possession, I beg you will burn them whenever it may be convenient." Eliza stopped writing to Anne after 1814, perhaps because it could be used as evidence of her mental illness. Anne visited Eliza at the asylum intermittently, but never returned the passion they had shared when they were young. After the asylum closed, Eliza was transferred to a house in a nearby village where she lived with her nurse until her death in 1860. In 1817, when Anne was sorting through her papers, she explored Eliza Rain's letters, and she recorded in her diary, quote, "My heart bled at the remembrance of the past. Poor girl, she did indeed love me truly."
While Eliza's same-sex desire contributed to her lifelong commitment to an asylum, Anne Lister maintained her freedom. Perhaps her whiteness, Englishness, and wealth shielded her from fates like Eliza's. Averill writes about this in her book a little bit. There were some men in Dublin who, through their wealth and connection with the theater and the arts, were able to live semi-openly as same-sex couples. This is also a phenomenon we see in Anne Lister's biography. Anne's same-sex desire was an open secret. Her lovers knew about her orientation, obviously, but Anne's aunt and uncle also knew. She often discussed her romantic entanglements and masculine qualities with them.
She probably consulted them most about Isabel, or Tib Norcliffe, with whom Anne had an on-again, off-again relationship for almost her entire adult life. Anne was always looking for a permanent relationship, someone who would not only be her lover, but also her companion, helpmate, and financial stability. While the Lister family was, in theory, wealthy and landed, in reality they struggled with money. Anne's aunts and uncles had no heirs, so her father was likely to inherit the family seat eventually. But he was eccentric, erratic, and incompetent with money. He bankrupted his nuclear family several times over. The Lister estate had potential to bring in good income, but it needed refurbishment and careful management. Anne Lister seemed to be the only family member who was capable of this. This is why she was designated as their heir to the Lister estate from a young age.
Like most people in the 18-teens and 1820s, Anne viewed possible partnerships through not only the lenses of love and sexual compatibility, but also as a contract that had the potential to either enrich or impoverish her estate. The problem was that Anne needed injections of capital to invest in the estate to make it the income-generating asset she knew it could be. Isabel Norcliffe had potential to make the Lister estate financially stable. She was the heir to a sizable estate. This was extremely attractive to Anne, and Isabel, or Tib, as Anne called her, was a delightful companion and popular socialite. She was outgoing, well-traveled, and socially adventurous. But for Anne, her charms ended there.
Anne was turned off by Tib's mannerisms, which were quite masculine, like her own. Anne felt that Tib had all the ingredients of a perfect partner, but that they were not arranged in such a way that could ever be acceptable to Anne. Tib drank too much, laughed too loudly, and was altogether too romantically and sexually assertive for Anne. While she cared deeply for Tib, it took a lot of convincing for Anne to accept her faults. So when future lovers betrayed Anne, she always came back to Tib as an option. In 1817, doubting her new lover, Anne wrote the following, quote, "As I was getting into bed, I began thinking how little confidence I had in Mariana, and how little likely it was that we should ever get together. I was very low. I felt that my happiness depended upon having some female companion whom I could love and depend upon, and my thoughts naturally turned to Isabella. I got out her picture and looked at it for 10 minutes with considerable emotion. I almost wished to persuade myself I could so manage her temper as to be happy with her."
Unfortunately for Tib, who seems to have favored a life partnership with Anne, it was not meant to be. There were just too many impediments for Anne to overcome. Anne sometimes complained about sex with Tib. Quote, "A good kiss last night, but she will make me be constantly feeling her, putting my finger up, etc., though I do it as little as I can help. She is too fond of gross language," end quote. Ultimately, Anne was just not sexually attracted to a mask woman. Referring to her own masculine nature, Anne said, quote, "Mr. Lally had been visiting at Moortown last September and said he would as soon turn a man loose in the house as me. As for Miss Norcliffe, 2 Jacks would not suit together," end quote. Still, Anne and Tib remained intimate friends and occasional lovers for the rest of Anne's life.
Tib was crucial to Anne's life in another way, however. She is responsible for introducing Anne Lister to Mariana Belcombe around 1812. Anne was infatuated by Mariana from the start. After falling for Mariana, Anne went back to Tib for intermittent roles in the hay, but she was always compared unfavorably to Mariana. By 1826, Anne was ready to move on from Tib permanently. Quote, "A kiss last night of Isabella, perhaps I may never have another." A kiss was Anne's euphemism for sex leading to orgasm. So when she says she gave someone 2 kisses or they gave her 3, she was referring to orgasms from same-sex sex.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing. Like, she's using kiss to mean, F, like to mean sex, but she actually always counts the number of orgasms. So
good for her, as one should.
Thinking about. Oh, as she should. Yeah. So, one of Anne's complaints about Tib was that she was not one of the uninitiated. Anne preferred women who were sexually inexperienced. In 1818, Anne complained about Tib, quote, "She has seen a great deal of vice abroad and heard a great deal of loose conversation. Her mind is not pure enough for me, but time must tell," end quote. Mariana Belcombe, especially when they were first introduced in 1812, had the requisite innocence and inexperience that Anne preferred.
Mariana Belcombe's family did not have a long pedigree, but they were respectable enough. Her father, Dr. William Belcombe, was a physician who served as a surgeon in the Royal Navy during the American Revolution. After he was decommissioned, he moved his family to continental Europe. He and his wife had 1 son and 5 daughters. Mariana was the middle daughter, born in 1788, which made her 1 year older than Anne Lister.
Anne was immediately taken with Mariana. She gushed about Mariana to Tib, quote, "She is indeed a charming girl, and from the real worth of her character has gained no mean portion of my esteem and regard. Yet all good mental qualities aside, your friend is a sweet-looking girl," end quote. We suspect that Anne and Mariana began a sexual relationship in December of 1812 during a visit to York. After the York visit, the two began a semi-long-distance affair. Mariana lived in London and Anne lived in Halifax, but both traveled extensively. During 1813, they wrote each other 60 letters. In 1814, Anne received 87 letters from Mariana. Unfortunately, these letters and the diaries from these years were burned. They were burned by Anne at Mariana's request. Based on the surviving diaries and letters, we can infer that these were passionate love letters. We can also assume that they had a robust sexual relationship. In later life, the two had sex several times per day whenever they were together.
And it was good sex. Anne would later write, quote, "No one has ever given me kisses like hers." Her later dalliances with Mariana, which we'll get into in a bit, were recorded in cipher, which Anne called crypt hand. Anne described one night of passion thusly, quote, "To last night, M spoke in the very act. Ah, she said, can you ever love anyone else? She knows how to heighten the pleasure of our intercourse. She often murmurs, oh, how delicious, just at the very moment. All her kisses are good ones." Mariana called Anne her Freddie, and according to the diaries, Mariana ignored Anne's menstruation and preferred her in men's clothing.
During this time, Anne's last surviving brother died by the drowning, as we had mentioned above, right? So Anne's aunts and uncles turned to Anne to continue on the Lister legacy. They were entirely aware that Anne was unlikely to marry a man. Anne wrote about conversations she had with him about her sexual orientation. Quote, "I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus, beloved by them in turn, my heart revolts from any other love but theirs." End quote. So her family decided to experimentally designate her as heir and to move her into Shibden Hall, the family seat, so she could learn about the running of the estate.
By early 1815, however, there was trouble in paradise. Mariana was being pursued by a wealthy older suitor, Charles Lawton of Lawton Hall. And to Anne's horror, Mariana was encouraging the courtship. Anne raged bitterly in her journal for years about what she saw as Mariana choosing wealth and comfort over love. Quote, "Never was so wretched in my life. Beginning of 1815, whatever might be her regard for me, it is very plain it bore but a very subservient portion to her regard for the good things of this world. I was in love, or surely I could not have been so blinded and acted with such doting folly. Oh, that I then could have given her up without a struggle." The early months of 1815 were a mere taste of the heartbreak Anne was to suffer for the rest of her life. Anne tried her hardest to convince Mariana to give up the scheme, citing their mutual love as the primary motivation. For a brief few months, Mariana gave in, postponing her nuptials. Mariana's family even intervened, begging Anne to not disrupt the courtship and acknowledging that Mariana should marry for financial security, even if she didn't like Charles Lawton. Anne reveled in her victory over Mariana's marriage plans and wrote fondly of these months, quote, "Surely no one ever doted on another as I did then on her. I fondly thought my love and happiness would last forever." But she was wrong.
In March 1816, Mariana married Charles Lawton and moved into Lawton Hall. But Mariana wanted the best of both worlds. She reasoned that as a wealthy, landed, married woman, that she would have bottomless resources to travel with Anne and continue their romance. Mariana hoped to give her husband an heir and then enjoy his wealth with her girlfriend on the side. So Mariana and Anne continued their romance intermittently. Mariana was able to convince Anne that this was just a detour in their great romance. She reasoned that since Charles Lawton was 2 decades older than her, that she would be widowed in short order. Then she'd have a large inheritance to bring with her to Shibden Hall, where she'd live the rest of her life with Anne. The insufficiency of this arrangement, however, became clear to Anne directly after the marriage. Charles and Mariana Lawton went on an extended honeymoon for 6 months, accompanied by an aristocratic retinue. Mariana's eldest sister, Nance, came along to help Mariana get settled into married life. Anne Lister met up with the party on occasion. During a trip to Buxton, a spa town, Anne flirted with Nance Belcombe. Anne was jealous of the sex she knew Mariana was having with her new husband.
During this dalliance with Nance, Anne Lister behaved in a way that most would interpret as abusive nowadays. After flirting with Nance all day, the two slept in the same bed and stayed up all night chatting. Anne told Nance that she only loved women and could never have feelings for a man. Nance, a very sympathetic soul, cried for Anne. The next morning, Anne berated her for believing her speech the night before, saying it was in jest. Nance was captivated by Anne and made arrangements to visit Shibden Hall in a couple of months. During that visit, Nance and Anne slept in the same bed, and Anne continued to coerce Nance into sex. The two stayed up all night, and at 4 a.m., Anne finally admitted her sexual orientation to Nance. Anne told Nance that she was attracted to her and asked her if she liked Anne any less for having learned this secret about her. Nance answered her with a kiss, an actual kiss this time. Anne was convinced that Nance had been conquered, but the sex stopped midstream because of Nance's nerves. Quote, "We went to great lengths, as we had often done before, such as feeling her all over, pushing my finger up her, etc. But still she did not get the last extremity."
Anne used Nance's reticence against her. After a couple days of coercion, Anne picked a fight with Nance, saying that, quote, she was acting unfairly, and that she, quote, ought either to make up her mind and let me have a kiss at once or change her manners altogether, end quote. Anne doesn't write much about Nance's replies, but Anne's guilt-tripping must have worked, because 2 days after this argument, Anne writes, quote, "Had a very good kiss last night, and Anne gave it to me." So Nance's real name is Anne, but they call her Nance. So Nance gave it to me with pleasure, not thinking it necessary to refuse me any longer, end quote. After they went all the way, Nance was plagued by moral doubts. Anne's diaries are filled with her conversations with Nance about the morality of same-sex sex. Anne was effective at arguing away her lover's moral scruples with lesbianism. Anne saw her own sexual attraction as evidence of the naturalness of same-sex attraction and same-sex sex. Quote, "I urged in my own defense the strength of natural feeling and instinct, for so I might call it. When we leave nature, we leave our only steady guide, and from that moment become inconsistent with ourselves," end quote.
After 3 weeks of this philosophizing to appease Nance's guilty conscience, Anne grew tired of her. She gave Nance an excuse about her family needing quiet and asked Nance to leave. Anne described her feelings for Nance this way, quote, "I do not admire her, but rather feel a sort of disgust for her. She is not nice, and her breath is disagreeable. However, her manners made me feel desire." After the lukewarm dalliance with Nance, Anne took a break from romance and focused on her studies. But in January of 1817, Anne had an opportunity to meet with Mariana, who showed up unannounced at Anne's home during a trip to York. The two ate dinner with Anne's family and then went back to Mariana's hotel for a romantic interlude. They spent the night and much of the next day together before Mariana went off to York. Mariana promised Anne that she would stop for another liaison on her way home from York in 2 weeks' time.
Right, so keep in mind that Anne is also sleeping with Mariana's sister, right? And Mariana doesn't know this. But in the meantime, disaster struck. Mariana's husband, Charles Lawton, intercepted a love letter Anne had written to his wife. The letter contained professions of love, admissions of sexual activity, and perhaps worst of all, their hopes of Charles's early demise so they could live happily ever after on Charles's money. Mariana appeared a few days later than expected at Shibden Hall to deliver this disastrous news. Charles forbade Mariana from seeing Anne, and it appeared as if he planned to screen Anne's letters to his wife. To avoid his prying eyes, Mariana learned Anne's crypt hand. Anne was no longer welcome at Lawton Hall, and the two women struggled to plan regular meetings. Mariana promised to visit Shibden Hall covertly once per year, but it appeared as if their plans to carry on their affair under Charles's nose was not going to happen.
After a blissful but heartbreaking 4 days together, the two parted. In the wake of Mariana's bad news, Anne rededicated herself to her studying, attending lectures and diary writing. Her diary seemed to be, in some sense, therapeutic for her. Quote, "What a comfort are my journals, how I can write in crypt all as it really is, and throw it off my mind and console myself. Thank God for it." There is no evidence that Anne ever told Mariana about her dalliances with her older sister Nance. Anne's diary suggests that she was, for most of her life, on the lookout for a life partner, even when she was hot and heavy with Mariana. She and Mariana would renew their dedication to each other several times during Anne's lifetime, but Anne was always torn about whether she should wait for Mariana, and in the end, she decided not to. All this time, Anne still kept Tib waiting in the wings. Now, we'll move on to discuss the rest of Anne's romances, but keep in mind that both Mariana and Tib will continue to pop up in her life. Tib as a deep friendship and lukewarm romance Anne wished she wanted to continue because it would make life simpler, and Mariana as her one great love who betrayed her by marrying a man.
One of Anne's entries during this time demonstrates how torn she was about her love life. Quote, "In the morning and part of the afternoon, got nearly to the bottom of a third page of my letter to Isabella. What a labor! For fear of saying too much, I know not what to say, and now such gets my trembling confidence in Mariana that I begin to feel some difficulty even in writing to her. I have not made use of consonants in my 2 last letters, nor have I said anything particularly affectionate. What will be my fate between these 2? At least perhaps I shall ultimately have neither of them. I should be much happier if I could really feel settled in a choice that was in every respect advisable." End quote.
In August of 1817, Anne was deep into her single girl summer when a woman in the same scientific lectures caught her eye. Miss Brown, dubbed Calista in Anne's journals, was a few years younger than Anne and from a socially inferior family. Due to this fact, Anne never truly considered seducing and pursuing Miss Brown, but she fantasized about her for the next few years. 2 days after they met, Anne wrote, quote, "Did nothing but dream of Miss Brown, and though I awoke at 6, yet had not resolution to get up, but lay dozing and thinking of the fair charmer. She is certainly very pretty. She seemed evidently not displeased with my attention, and I have felt all possible inclination to be as foolish as I ever was in former days. In fact, I shall be much better out of the way of the lovely Maria, for such is her name, than in it."
She's saying, like, I know this is bad for me, but I still want her.
Well, who's Maria?
It's Miss Brown.
Oh, okay, because you said she called her Calista, but then...
She does, but Maria is her actual first name, I guess. She calls people by different names all the time. Like, she calls Tib Isabel and Isabella and Tib. She calls Miss Brown without an E and Miss Brown with an E. So it's just one of those things where it's sort of unclear, and I think colloquially people went by different things, you know, even if their legal name was different. So that's who she's talking about, Miss Brown, and she's saying, like, this is no good for me, but I'm still going to do it.
Okay.
So Miss Brown is mentioned often in the diary for the next year, but Anne appears to have not made any headway with her. By August 1818, Anne is doing her best to forget her Calista. She wrote, quote, "Thought the matter seriously over, lamented, prayed God to have mercy on me and to help me, and resolved never more to mention Miss B, and to avoid her entirely for the last time." End quote. But upon her next meeting with Miss Brown, Anne was again smitten. Over the next 2 days, she wrote, quote, "How changed since last night when I declared to seek after the girl only once more. This once has done the business. I like her, and this morning's walk and having got her to meet me tomorrow have certainly made me, shall I call it, happier than I was before. At any rate, she does not show any antipathy to my attentions." And then she wrote, quote, "This meeting with Miss B seems to have stimulated and roused me altogether. I cannot live happily without female society, without someone to interest me." End quote.
All this time, though, Anne never pursued sex with Miss Brown or professed her romantic feelings towards her. This is likely because she knew Miss Brown wasn't the perfect match. She brought no inheritance or prestige to the match, and Anne already had 2 imperfect matches in Tib and Mariana, which taunted her. This is fortunate because in 1819, Miss Brown got engaged to a Scotsman named Mr. Kelly. Unlike Mariana's sham of a marriage, Miss Brown's engagement appeared to be a love match. Anne wrote, quote, "She told me I was the only one in Halifax to whom she would have mentioned the present case, but she is in love, it seems, and this gives me little hope of making much impression on her in the amatory way." With Miss Brown out of the picture, Anne Lister turned back to Tib and Mariana. Tib stayed at Shibden Hall for some of 1819, and Anne could tell that they were not on the same page. Quote, "Poor soul, she little thinks how things are. She feels secure. I scarce can bear it. I wish she knew all, and all was settled." Apparently, Tib suggested the two move in together once Tib inherited her parents' estate. During this visit, it became clear to Tib that she didn't have Anne's heart and that she would always share Anne with others. Perhaps as a way of showing that she understood the ground rules, Tim, Anne, and Miss Brown, whose family was visiting, shared cheeky kisses in the Shibden Hall garden.
And there's a television show called Gentleman Jack about Anne Lister, and these cheeky kisses are like one of the focal points of the show, and it's called Kissgate. So Anne's doubts about Tib grew during this visit. She witnessed Tib's excessive drinking with disgust and complained constantly about her manners. The two were experiencing trouble in their sex life as well. For example, Anne recorded what happened when she propositioned Tib one night. Quote, "Tib was going to sleep, but I would have a kiss. She says it gives her a pain in the back. I feel towards her differently, more coolly than I did. I cannot feel that she is, or ever can be, all to me I want and wish." End quote. Anne was quickly reminded why she and Tib did better as friends. Well, friends who had occasional sex, obviously. So, at the same time, Mariana appeared to fall deeper into married life. Anne lamented, quote, "I suppose she is more comfortable now with C." Remember, that's Mariana's husband, Charles. "She has her carriage and the luxuries of life and thinks proportionately less of me." End quote. Anne never really forgave Mariana for choosing financial security over a life with her, which is interesting because Anne also based her romantic decisions on financial security and social status. However, Mariana lived rent-free in Anne's head. When Anne saw Mariana in person for the first time in 2 years, they interrogated each other about their sex lives. Anne just had to know how often Mariana had sex with her husband. And for anyone who's curious, she guessed about 20 times per year. Anne kept her own sexual activities with Tib, Nance, and almost Miss Brown to herself.
Anne was enraged by Mariana's sexual activities with her husband, Charles Lawton, writing, quote, "I felt that she was another man's wife." Yeah, she was, Anne. This is interesting because it shows another man that, in Anne's mind, she was a man. And others felt the same. Anne wrote in her diary, quote, "The people generally remark as I pass along how much I am like a man." One time, as she walked down the street, a stranger observed her and yelled, "That's a man!" And his companion yelled out, "Does your cock stand?" When Anne visited York, prostitutes solicited her as they did the men. Sometimes Anne even fantasized about being a man, quote, "supposing myself in men's clothes and having a penis, though nothing more." Anne often wrote about trying on men's clothes and sitting in her room with them on. She once wrote, quote, "began this morning to sit before breakfast in my drawers put on with gentlemen's braces."
The horror, right. And so all of this stuff she is writing in cipher. So if any person was going to read her diary, they would just read the boring bits, and then the juicy bits are in cipher. And that's actually really helpful too, because it tells scholars what Anne perceived to be acceptable to the public and what wasn't, if that makes sense. These wearing gentlemen's braces or whatever, which I think means like pants, was not acceptable. That was in cipher. So in a pre-identity politics society, it's hard to say what this really means. If Anne lived today, would she be trans, non-binary, or a butch lesbian maybe? We can't know. But what's interesting is that her loved ones and even her casual acquaintances seemed willing to concede that she was quite masculine. And women who had never had any other same-sex attractions, Mariana, Nance, Miss Brown, and several others, were attracted to Anne. It suggests that queer history is a lot more complex and that queerness was more common than we assume. That assumption comes from the lack of documentary evidence in most cases. Historical queer people often did not record their feelings or their encounters, right, because it wasn't safe. Those who did destroyed them before their deaths. Those few that survived their author's death were destroyed by families out of shame. That's why Anne's diary is so incredibly important. It gives us insight into a reality that many want to deny. There have always been, and there always will be, queer people.
Okay, back to Anne's anger at Mariana for having sex with her own husband. Anne goes on to compare Mariana's arrangement with her husband as legal prostitution. Petulantly, Anne refused Mariana sex the first night that they spent together to make the extent of her displeasure clear. But Anne could not hold out for long. Quote, "From the kiss she gave me, it seemed as if she loved me as fondly as ever. By and by, we seemed to drop asleep. But, by and by, I perceived she would like another kiss, and she whispered, 'Come again a bit, Freddie.' For a little while I pretended to sleep. In fact, it was inconvenient. But soon I got up a second time, again took off, went to her a second time, and in spite of it all, she really gave me pleasure."
Anne and Mariana were able to meet again in the spring of 1820. The two sorted through their letters to each other over the years, and Anne allowed Mariana to read her diary entries from the years when Mariana first got married. Anne even confessed her obsession with Miss Brown. So this is really the first time that Anne confessed any of her other sort of loves, I guess, to Mariana. Mariana was overcome with guilt and jealousy. Quote, "She grieved over what I had suffered and would never doubt me again." End quote. This emotional encounter sparked a renewal of their love. Anne wrote, quote, "Sat up lovemaking. She conjured me to be faithful, to consider myself as married, and always to act to other women as if I was M's husband." End quote. Anne decided to, quote, "now begin to think and act as if she were indeed my wife," end quote. But when Mariana asked her to verbalize a promise to her and only her, Anne avoided answering.
A few months later, Tib's father died, and Mariana went into a tailspin, concerned that Anne would forget their promise to each other and sleep with Tib, or more, to comfort her. Mariana wrote, quote, "My Fred, will this melancholy event make any difference to you or me? I shall not lose you, my husband, shall I? Oh, no, no. You will not, cannot forget I am your constant, faithful, and affectionate wife." These reminders incensed Anne, and to be fair, Mariana was free to sleep with her husband whenever she wanted. So Anne rebelled a bit, writing that she felt, quote, "as much at liberty as ever."
Right, so Mariana is saying to her, like, remember, you promised me, and Anne is just like, I'm going to do whatever I want. It's really interesting to see what Anne says to other people versus what she writes in her diary. And you can see, like, you know, she's like, okay, well, I have to make Mariana feel secure, but actually I'm going to do this, right? So this was apparently true that she felt at liberty because in October of 1820, Anne Lister visited Tib at her family seat, Langton Hall. Immediately, Anne clocked a woman named Mary Valence, who she had met years before. Miss Valence was enamored with Anne and asked Anne to visit her room late at night. Anne was supposed to be sharing Tib's bed with her, but she sneaked out and found Miss Valence's room. The two were in the early stages of lovemaking when Tib crashed into the room looking for Anne. Anne, quote, got quit of Tib, meaning she got rid of her, and went back to Miss Valence, who was, according to her maid, suffering from a complaint that Anne took to mean she was aroused. Quote, Burnett, the maid, says her, meaning Miss Valence's complaint, is quite on her nerves. I know it is, and I am the best doctor. I soon found out what was the matter, kissed and put my tongue in while I had the 3 fingers of my right hand pushed as far as they would go up there, end quote. It continues, but we'll leave the rest to your imagination.
Tib and Anne's relationship may have been an open secret among Tib's family because Tib's sister Charlotte berated Anne for her attentions to Miss Valence. After Charlotte's protests, Anne turned her attentions away from Miss Valence and towards a newly arrived guest, Nance Belcombe. And remember, Nance is Mariana's oldest sister, whom Anne coerced into sex years before. Anne again seduced Nance, but became quickly annoyed with Nance's moral scruples as before. She also didn't desire Nance as much as she did Miss Valence. So poor Nance suffers a lot of criticism in Anne's diary. Anne continues on this path of chase and conquer during her entire visit to Langdon. Sometime after her sex with Nance, another Belcombe sister arrives at Langdon, evidence that this was quite an interconnected social circle. Henrietta Belcombe was the second sister, just below Nance and above Mariana. though by this time she was referred to as Mrs. Milne because she'd married Lieutenant Colonel Milne of York. It's unclear how far Anne's seduction of Mrs. Milne went, but we know that Anne spent hours every night in Mrs. Milne's room. Both Nance and Miss Valence reproached Anne for neglecting them in Mrs. Milne's favor, to which Anne replied, quote, "Said I could not help it. Mrs. Milne was fascinating." Before the visit was over, Anne also purportedly turned her attentions to the youngest Belcombe sister, Louisa. Good gosh.
I know. She's obviously, like, it's a little bit of, like, self-destruction happening here, where she's supposed to be with Tib, you know. Tib's father just died, and she's supposed to be, like, comforting Tib. And instead of being with Tib, she's with Miss Valence, and then with Nance, and then with Mrs. Milne, and then with Louisa. So she's having a lot of sex. So the visit lasted until January 1821, when all the guests, including Anne, finally left Tib's house. Anne relocated to the Belcombe home and had sex with Nance, quote, "whom I easily persuaded to sleep with me," end quote. Anne felt bad for using Nance for sex and for being unfaithful to Mariana 4 times over during the holiday, writing, quote, "I shall not think much about her, but get out of the scrape as well as I can. Sorry and remorseful to have been in it at all. Heaven forgive me, and may M, meaning Mariana, never know it," end quote. To assuage her guilt, Anne spent 4 hours writing Mariana a letter in which she promised from thenceforth to be faithful to Mariana. So she justified this to herself that the past 4 dalliances didn't really matter and that she was starting anew at the time of letter writing, but she also allowed Mariana to think that she was voicing the same promise that they had made months earlier before her affairs at Langton Hall. Mariana, not knowing anything about Anne's escapades at Langton, received her words as affirming their earlier oath. So Mariana just read her words and she was like, oh, she is affirming. She is promised to me. Anne was sort of playing a game. She said, well, from this point forward, I'm promised to you, meaning after all the stuff she already did at Langton Hall. But Mariana didn't know about any of that stuff, so Mariana thought she was just kind of repeating the earlier vow.
In July of 1821, Mariana and Anne were able to meet again for the christening of Mariana's niece. They took the opportunity to perform a nuptial ceremony, of course not legal in Britain at the time. They, as a couple, became Mariana's niece's godmothers. Anne and Mariana, thinking of themselves as newlyweds, made love during this trip. Unfortunately, it was during this trip that Anne contracted venereal disease from Mariana, who purportedly contracted it from her husband Charles, who had had some affairs. Mariana's brother Stephen, the father of her new goddaughter, was a physician, so Anne approached him discreetly with the "I have a friend who is suffering these symptoms" trick. Anne was infected with venereal disease, believed by scholars to be trichomoniasis, for the rest of her life.
It can be cured by antibiotics, but I think it's actually a parasitic infection.
A few months later, Nance propositioned Anne again, but Anne refused, perhaps mindful of her new condition. Nonetheless, Anne had somewhat unenthusiastic sex with Tib a few months later. Quote, "I hope Tib will not have caught any infection from me. At the moment of my offering to sleep with her, I forgot this, and afterwards there was no retracting." Anne continued to go between Nance and Mariana for the following year. Tib was available and always willing. Mariana was harder for her to spend time with and was still considered her great love.
In 1822, Anne and her aunt, who was also named Anne, there's like 10 people named Anne, so I try to make it as not confusing as possible. So Anne and her aunt visited the ladies of Llangollen. So Avril's episode from this series is about these 2 women, Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler, who lived their entire lives together. Their cottage became a place of pilgrimage for gardeners and closeted queers alike. Anne met only Sarah Ponsonby during her visit. Eleanor Butler wasn't present. She was ill. So her detailed description of Sarah, recorded in her diary, provides a fascinating insight into what she thought about this woman. Quote, "A large woman so as to waddle in walking, but though not taller than myself, in a blue, shortish-waisted cloth habit, the jacket unbuttoned, showing a plain, plaited, frilled habit shirt, a thick white cravat, rather loosely put on, hair powdered, the remains of a very fine face, coarse-ish white cotton stockings, ladies' slippers, shoes cut low down, the foot hanging a little over. Altogether, a very odd figure. Mild and gentle, certainly not masculine, and yet there was a je ne sais quoi striking." End quote. Anne tried to discreetly establish whether Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler were more than friends. She asked, quote, if they were classical, end quote, to which Sarah Ponsonby replied, "No, thank God. From Latin and Greek, I am free," end quote. So what Anne's trying to do here, because in sort of classical Greek literature, lesbianism and homosexuality were kind of common and accepted. And so Anne's trying to say, like, hey, you guys gay together? But I don't think Sarah Ponsonby quite understood what she was asking and was just like, no. Mariana, who had already visited the cottage some years before, wrote to Anne after this visit, quote, "Tell me if you think their regard has always been platonic, and if you ever believed pure friendship could be so exalted. If you do, I shall think there are brighter amongst mortals than I ever believed there were," end quote. The ladies of Llangollen gave Anne and Mariana hope that their life could be like that one day.
In 1823, Anne met a new friend, Francis Pickford, who was called Frank by her friends. Pickford often visited her sister in Halifax, and she developed a reputation for being very masculine, like Anne Lister. The two met at a chemistry lecture and became fast friends. This seems to have been another two Jacks situation. Anne wrote about Frank, quote, "I wish you would care a little more about dress, at least not wear such an old-fashioned, short-waisted fright of a brown habit," which is a men's jacket, with yellow metal buttons. Her friendship with Frank affirmed what Anne thought she already knew, that she was into feminine women. Unlike Frank, quote, "I would rather have a pretty girl to flirt with. She is clever for a lady, but her style of manner and character do not naturally suit me. She is not lovable." Frank, on the other hand, was romantically interested in Anne. To ward off Frank's advances, Anne had to pretend to be asexual. Frank even outright admitted her feelings for women to Anne. Stone-faced, Anne denied having similar feelings. Frank didn't believe her, so Anne eventually conceded that her sexual orientation was theoretical, while Frank's was actually a practicing desire of the female sex. And this was obviously a lie. And Frank didn't really believe it either. Anne kept up the act until Frank left town. Anne was satisfied with how she had handled the situation. She said, quote, or she wrote, quote, "I am now let into her secret, and she forever barred from mine. Are there more Miss Pickfords in the world than I have ever before thought of?" That's an interesting insight. Like, just how common is this really, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And like Halifax is like a small town. It's not like, you know, like London or something. It's a very, very small town. So the fact that there were other, like, what we would call, I guess, butch lesbians around tells us that it was more common than we thought, even in the 1820s, you know? So it's really strange, at least to me, it's really strange that Anne behaved this way. So she and Frank could have been confidants, right? In a world where women like them desperately needed it. Strangely, they remained friends, but they never spoke of their sexuality again. Apparently, Anne was not looking for friendship and a confidant. She wanted a very femme, lifelong romantic partner, one with an inheritance and social capital that would improve even her own elite standing. With Frank gone, Anne went back to Tib and Mariana.
By 1823, Anne Lister's relationship with her two closest companions was reaching a crisis point. Tib's excessive snuff-taking and drinking alienated the very health-conscious Anne, and Mariana's continued marriage was frustrating. Perhaps the most damaging was the venereal disease scandal we mentioned earlier that had by this time created a painful chain of infection. Charles Lawton had contracted the disease from a servant, passed it to Mariana, who transmitted it to Anne, who then infected Isabella, creating ongoing shame and tension between all three women. Meanwhile, Anne was deeply mortified on a trip to Scarborough in 1823 by Mariana's criticisms of her masculine appearance, and Mariana had expressed reservations about their unconventional relationship becoming public knowledge. Anne felt totally and utterly rejected by her great love. These mounting pressures led Anne to a profound disillusionment with both relationships. She wrote, quote, "It has taught me that, though Mariana loves me, it is without that beautiful romance of sentiment that all my soul desires. But mine are not affections to be returned in this world." Anne told Mariana, quote, "I always considered your marriage legal prostitution." Despite Tibb's devotion, her drinking and snuff-taking made her an increasingly unappealing life partner. The crisis reached its climax in 1824 when Anne decided to travel to Paris, both to escape these painful dynamics and to seek medical treatment for her venereal complaint.
During her time abroad, Anne met Maria Barlow, the daughter of a captain and American Revolutionary War veteran. He fought on the Loyalist side. Mrs. Barlow was also the widow of Frederick Barlow, a slain lieutenant colonel who'd been killed in the Battle of Salamanca in 1812. She had a 12-year-old daughter. Anne and Mrs. Barlow took an instant liking to each other. When Anne first laid eyes on her, she noticed that Mrs. Barlow had, quote, "a nice little figure," and made sure to shoot a glance, quote, "directed at her bosom," end quote. Anne recorded their first sexual encounters, which took place 3 weeks after they met. Quote, "I had kissed and pressed Mrs. B on my knee till I had a complete fit of passion. My knees and thighs shook, my breathing and everything told her what was the matter. She said she did me no good. I said it was a little headache and I could go to sleep. I then leaned on her bosom and pretended to sleep, kept pottering about and rubbing the surface of her queer," which Anne uses the word queer to refer to a vulva. Then made several gentle efforts to put my hand up her petticoats, which, however, she prevented. But she so crossed her legs and leaned against me that I put my hand over and grubbled her on the outside of her petticoats till she was evidently a little excited, end quote. So they grubbled means like, you know, fondle on top of your clothes, basically.
During her months with Mrs. Barlow, Anne began to see Mariana as provincial and financially burdensome. Anne and Mrs. Barlow continued to advance their sexual relationship. After a few months, they decided to move in together and into Paris apartments. Anne's entries become increasingly graphic and sexual during this time. One of the more tame entries read, quote, "Kept the candle burning last night for some time after getting into bed, hoping to see her, but she would not let me. She had a cup of tea in bed, and we grubbled," so sexual touching over clothes, again just before getting up. Finally, she let me put my head under the clothes, kiss the top of her queer, and look at her.
But after a few months in their Paris apartment, Anne became disenchanted with Mrs. Barlow for reasons that seem to be related to Anne Lister's own gender identity. We'll read the entire entry here because the context may be important, so heads up, the descriptions are sexually graphic. If you're into that, read the Mrs. Barlow parts of Anne's diary for sure. If you're not, you've been warned. So this is one of the last times that Anne and Mrs. Barlow made love. Quote, "A strong excitement last night just after getting into bed. She said again this morning it was the best she had ever had. A very good one an hour before we got up, slumbering all the while afterwards. On getting out of bed, she suddenly touched my queer," remember that means vulva. "I started back. 'Ah,' she said, 'that is because you are a pucelle. I must undo that. I can give you relief. I must do to you as you did to me.'" So basically, Mrs. Brown is offering to return the favor to Anne. "I liked not this, and said she astonished me. She asked if I was angry. No, merely astonished. However, I found I could not easily make her understand my feelings on the subject, and I dropped the matter altogether. Mariana would not make such a speech. This is womanizing me too much. Mariana will suit me better. I cannot do much for Mrs. B except with my finger. I am more sure of going on well with Mariana, who is contented with having myself next to her." End quote. So essentially, Anne's sort of talking about how she likes to be, I guess what we would nowadays call the top. Like, she likes to be the one doing things to the other person, and that's what she gets pleasure out of. And then when Mrs. Barlow tried to be the top, she was all like, "Ew, gross. No, like that, you're treating me like I'm a woman." And it's like, well, you are a woman, but, she didn't really feel like a typical woman, right? So Anne left Mrs. Barlow immediately after this and instead pursued a fling with Madame de Rosny, which is the Duchess de Berry, who was like this, famous French aristocrat who occasionally had sex with women, and Anne just slept with her for several weeks.
Anne returned to Yorkshire in 1828. This period marked the beginning of the end of the intense triangular relationship that had dominated Anne's emotional life: Tib, Anne, Mariana. Though Anne continued to have occasional sex and occasional romantic renewals with Mariana over the next few years, she no longer believed in their future plans together. Anne removed Mariana from her will and finally severed the relationship entirely in 1828, a few months after her return to England. Anne also distanced herself from Tib, reasoning that Tib was self-destructing with alcohol. They remained friends and had a few more sexual encounters, but Tib appears to have given up her campaign for Anne's partnership, giving Anne the freedom to find her wife once and for all.
By 1832, Anne was 41 years old, and she was taking her role as heir to the Shibden estate more seriously than ever. She had had 2 more false starts with 2 potential great loves. Anne Lister chose these 2 women with their inheritance and social standing in mind. Sabella Maclean was a Scottish aristocrat whom Anne seduced by letter from 1825 to 1829. Their correspondence became more promising for Anne in 1828 when they agreed to meet. Anne traveled to Edinburgh, where she and Sabella became lovers. Anne was trying to convince the Maclean family to let Sabella move into Shibden with her when Sabella died from consumption in 1830. Anne then pursued a relationship with a British aristocrat named Vere Hobart. Vere was sophisticated, educated, and elegant, with enviable connections to the high society circles in which Anne aspired to move. Vere was the cousin of Lord and Lady Stuart de Rothsay, the British ambassador in Paris. The relationship was characterized by Anne's passionate pursuit and Vere's gentle but firm rejection. Anne did a lot of fruitless sweet-talking by the fire, a lot of sitting too close to Vere on the sofa, a lot of listening longingly to her playing sentimental songs on the piano, and a lot of getting absolutely nowhere. Anne would hang over Vere as she played piano and attempted to create romantic moments. This went on from 1829 to 1832, but then Anne's hopes were dashed when Vere accepted the proposal of a man. Anne was required to attend the wedding, where Vere gently told her what she already knew, that she just wasn't attracted to women. The actual words that Vere told her at the wedding was, "I'm just not like that." Which sounds very modern to me. I don't know, just really weird.
It sounds like Anne isn't very good at taking a hint. I think that nowadays a lot of people would read her behavior as very predatory sometimes. And I think that is fair in some cases, like especially with Nance. And this is an example too with Vere. But the problem is that in a world where you can't be open about your desires and your romantic interests, you kind of have to be manipulative like that. Like, even people who did want to have sex with Anne kind of had to be cajoled into it because it was so taboo. So it's really, really hard to kind of interpret her actions after the fact now because, yeah, she seems predatory. And that guy in the beginning of the show, Burrell, he was like, oh my God, none of her female friends were safe from her, like kind of treating her like a predator. But also there wasn't the option of her just being like, hey, who wants to be gay with me? Like that wasn't even an option. Yeah, good points. Anne's search for the perfect companion finally ended in 1834 when she realized that her great love had been under her nose all of this time. Anne Walker was the wealthy heiress who lived on the estate next door. Though they had known each other for decades, it was only in 1834 that Anne Lister began to see Anne Walker in a romantic light. They soon began an intense romantic and sexual relationship. Anne introduced Anne to the estate management of Shibden Hall, and they attended social events together, living openly as a couple. In 1834, they took communion together at Holy Trinity Church and thereafter considered themselves married, again without legal recognition, of course. Anne Walker was very different from Anne's previous lovers. She was nervous, dependent, and easily manipulated. Anne was attracted to her wealth. Anne Walker was one of the richest women in Yorkshire, but she also felt genuine affection for her. Their relationship was both protective and controlling, with Anne Lister managing Anne Walker's finances and making most decisions for both of them. In many ways, Anne and Anne had a typical marriage for the 1830s. They bickered, they compromised, they rubbed each other's backs when they were sore, they confided in each other and occasionally pissed each other off. They even rented a pew in their local church like any 19th century hetero couple would do.
The sexual aspect of their relationship was important to Anne Lister, though she found Anne Walker less passionate than her previous lovers. Anne Lister's diary records their intimate thoughts, noting both the physical pleasure and her sometimes frustrated attempts to awaken Anne Walker's sexual appetite. In her younger years, this occasional sexual incompatibility would have been a deal breaker for Anne Lister, but at this point in her life, it was something she was willing to endure, especially since Anne Walker enjoyed adventure and travel as much as Anne Lister did. It also helped that Anne Walker's estate was large and that it enriched the Listers' estate immeasurably.
Anne Lister and Anne Walker faced challenges and opposition to their relationship, including from Anne's family, who were wary of Anne Lister's attempts to share in Anne Walker's inheritance. However, they pursued projects on the Shibden estate and traveled extensively together throughout Scandinavia, continental Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. When Mariana finally met who Tibb's sister Charlotte called her successor during a gathering at Lawton Hall, she was not impressed. Indeed, Mariana attempted to seduce Anne Lister one morning during the visit. Anne wrote, quote, "She could not get over her love for me, but I behaved with perfect propriety." It appears as if Anne Lister had finally found the woman who won her loyalty, even when she was tempted by the woman that she once called her great love. If only Anne and Anne had had more years together, they might have succeeded in modeling themselves after the ladies of Langland. But it was not meant to be. Tragically, in 1840, at age 49, Anne Lister died of a fever while traveling in the Caucasus Mountains with Anne. After Anne's death, Anne Walker took on the arduous task of returning her remains to Halifax, which took 6 months. After return to Shibden, Walker faced legal disputes over the division of their estate. Anne Walker was, in 1843, declared of unsound mind and made to live in the care of relatives. And this begs the question of whether Anne Walker, like Eliza Reign, was vulnerable to mental illness, or at least accusations of mental illness, because of her unusual partnership with Anne Lister. Amongst Anne Lister's friends, Anne Walker was regarded as a widow, but the Walker family and British society at large never acknowledged their marriage. Being unable to mourn her life partner publicly must have taken a toll on her, and sadly, Anne Walker died in 1854.
What makes Anne's diaries so invaluable to LGBTQ plus history isn't just their explicit documentation of same-sex relationships. It's their revelation of a fully realized queer life. Anne didn't just exist in the shadows. She owned property, she managed estates, she traveled the world, and she formed deep, lasting relationships. She saw herself as a husband to her wives, dressed in men's clothing in private, and navigated the complex social dynamics of 19th century England while remaining fundamentally true to herself, which, when you think about it, it's just shocking that she was able to do that. Her story also reminds us how precarious queer history can be. If Arthur Burrell had succeeded in his mission to destroy these diaries, we would have lost one of the most complete records of LGBTQ plus life from this era. Instead, thanks to the Lister family's ultimate decision to preserve them and the dedicated work of scholars like Helena Whitbread and Jill Liddington, we have this extraordinary window into a world we might never have known existed. Anne Lister's legacy extends far beyond her romantic relationships. She was a scholar, a traveler, a businesswoman, and a pioneer who refused to accept the limitations society placed on her gender and sexuality. Her coded diary entries prove that LGBTQ plus people have always been here, have always loved deeply, and have always found ways to create meaningful lives, even when, perhaps especially when, the world told them they couldn't. In preserving Anne's story, we preserve something essential about the human experience, that love finds a way, that authenticity demands courage, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply living as yourself.
Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, we invite you to follow us on Blue Sky and Instagram at dig_history. If you have a comment or question or want to share some kind words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org. We love listener mail. If you're an educator, we've got a compendium of episodes that you can use in the classroom and free teaching resources, including full lesson plans, on our website at digpodcast.org. You'll also find full bibliographies, the scripts of all our episodes, resources, and a link to our swag store at digpodcast.org. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.